I'm Tom, and this week's Quick Tips is going to be a guide about
how to appease the RepRap gods by sacrificing a printer.
So, while the gods may or may not appreciate your offerings, salvaging a 2D printer is often a good way to find some usable parts for building a 3D printer on the cheap. So, the tools you're going to need are a couple screwdrivers and a handful of pliers. And if you like working fast, a cordless drill isn't going to hurt either. So, the basic procedure is starting out with taking out all screws that are visible. For example, there's one here. I'll screw that. And these screws are usually not much use. So to start out, we're going to remove all parts that we can remove without applying any force, like the paper tray. It simply comes out. And the lid comes off. So here's the first thing that might be useful, and that's the sheet of glass that's in here. This is usually a rather large piece of glass. If you have a glass cutter, you can cut it to size and use it on your heated bed. So let's take a... And in general, because you're not going to be putting this back together, you can undo all screws that you run across. Look for screws hidden under the little plastic feet. Nope. And if you look here, it's the material these printer cases are usually made of is PS high E, which is the same thing as the high impact polystyrene that is often used for printing dissolvable supports. So if you have a filament extruder, you can grind that up and re-extrude it to usable filament. So this is where the screwdrivers come in. If there are any parts that are not cooperating, the screwdriver will pop them straight out. And the other thing that's usually holding these printer frames together is clips like these that simply need to be pressed down with a screwdriver. Like this one. Until they come loose. Or alternatively, you can simply break the case. By the way, if you have safety goggles, now is a good time to put those on. Where do we go from here? There you go. Look at that, that's probably like 15 LEDs. That's okay, there's our first part. Oh! Look, the lid just came off. Let's put that aside and see what's in here. And there's a clip. And look at that, more clips. Okay, there's our glass panel. This is actually fairly large, and it's being held in by glue strips over here. So this is a pretty good size. It should easily fit any printer. Let's put that aside. So this is the actual image sensor from the scanner. It's not going to be much use in a 3D printer, but it could be useful for other things. This is the first thing that could be useful for a 3D printer. This is a light barrier, which is usually used in opto instos. So we're going to keep that. Look at that, they're not even using real linear slides anymore. They're just sliding the scanner head on some looped plastic. So the next useful thing in here is the belt. This is probably not going to be much use as is, as it's a fairly flimsy belt. It's better than nothing, so we're going to keep that as well. And the next useful thing. This is a 4-wire stepper motor which can be driven by all normal RepRap electronics. So if you're happy with the fact that it's a super weak one, it might just be the one you want to go with. So it is a super small and super weak one, but it's better than nothing. And it's free. And the rest in here is pretty much scraps. Unless you want to use the gearing for the motor. This has some backlash, so it's not going to be much use. And this is the printer's control panel, or user control panel. There's a whole bunch of LEDs on there, a bunch of buttons, and a 7.5 segment LED thing. So again, it's not much use for a 3D printer, but it has a couple nice components on there, so we're going to keep that. Next up, the printer's main body. And we can already see one thing that's looking interesting, and that's this rail. These are usually like 10mm rails, and this one is as well. These are proper chromed, hardened linear rails, and they're the exact type that you want for a 3D printer. So if you salvage like 2 or 3 printers, you're likely going to have enough components to build one axis of your 3D printer. That was easy. So the main idea here is that if you remove enough screws, at some point this thing is going to come apart. So I'm just staring at everything that I see. And these flat band cables are, well, not too useful. By the way, this sheet metal can be rather sharp on the corners, so unless you're being very careful, wearing some gloves is probably also a fairly good idea. Ink. Ah, look at that, 50 bucks worth of ink. This is probably where the main board of the printer is sitting. We're going to set this aside for later, but there's usually not much in here that's interesting for building a 3D printer. So the way that the printhead moves on these 2D printers is pretty much identical on every single one. There's usually a DC motor, which just turns left and right depending on how much current is applied, and which drives a belt which pulls the carriage left and right. And then there's this strip that usually has like a do not touch icon on it, and this actually has a whole bunch of fine lines that is read by an encoder sitting on the carriage, which then determines at what position the carriage is. So this is a system that works without using a stepper driver, but still gives pretty accurate positioning. However, the RepRap style 3D printers do not support this type of linear motion yet, so this isn't much use for us. Oh, there were a couple screws in there. Okay, so how do we get this apart? Oh, look at that. So the only thing remaining in here is the power supply, and we're going to take a look at that and see if it's any use at all, but usually it isn't. Let's see, by the way, power supplies are not for the untrained. These can kill you painfully if you don't know what you're doing and what parts you can and cannot touch. So unless you know exactly what you're doing, please do not mess with the power supplies and just buy a pre-made one. So yeah, we're going to have to measure this. So let's set that with the other parts. And there's one more motor. This one works exactly like the one that moves the printhead left and right. The encoder is this clear wheel. There. So this is the parking spot for the printhead. Not much use for us. Okay, so we should be able to pull this straight up, either by undoing the other side, or by simply modifying the chassis a bit. So look at that. It's still stuck. Because it also has the same type of spring-loaded mechanism on the other side. There we go. So let's get out my super high quality digital calipers, and this is a 10mm. Shit. Oh crap! This is a 9mm chromed hardened linear rod. You're not going to be able to get any kind of bearings for this one. The last printer I disassembled had a 10mm one, which is way more useful since you can simply get LM10UU bearings to ride on this. But this is 9mm, this is practically useless for us. And there's another belt. Again, this is not the super ideal belt for a 3D printer, but if it's the only thing you can get a hold of, you might just stick with it. So this is the reader for this linear encoder strip. Again, it's not much use for a 3D printer, but it might come in handy in some other project at some point in time. So I'm going to keep it. You might not want to. Okay, so this looks like a stainless steel bar. The rollers come right off, and it's a 5mm one. Yeah, well, RepRap is building or has built a printer with 4mm rods, really tiny little 3D art. And for that, this guy might be useful. So, as with many of the other parts, for a normal printer, this isn't going to be much use. Okay, there's one more bar in here. Okay, so this bar has some kind of anti-slip coating on it, which pretty much makes it useless for 3D printers. It is... this one is the 10mm one. And it looks like we're done here. So let's see what we got. We got a linear image sensor. Not useful for a 3D printer, nice project to hack on. We got 2 DC motors. Not useful in a 3D printer, nice for other projects. We got the control board with a bunch of switches, LEDs, and a 7.5 segment display. We got a power supply of unknown quality and voltage, and we'll have to measure that out. We got one light barrier that we can use for an end stop. So this one is actually the first thing that's useful for a 3D printer. We got a little pancake stepper motor. If you want to print really slow, you can use this, for example, for an x-axis, or if you get a second identical one, you could use it for a z-axis. Then we have this 5mm rod. Since this is not chrome plated, you shouldn't be using it for a linear slide. We got a useless 9mm linear rod. We got another useless 10mm stainless steel or steel coated rod. And the linear encoder and stuff. So the only 2 things that might be remotely useful for building a 3D printer is this little stepper motor and this guy. So older printers or bigger printers might have more loot in them, but generally don't expect to be able to build a whole 3D printer just from salvaging 2D printers. So as always, thanks for watching.